I'm going to ask everyone another series of questions, and I guess you could try to keep these answers to just 2 minutes, okay? So the questions are, Dr. Goldhamer, you are saying to do a no salt, no sugar, no oil diet. So if you're against oil, what fats do you recommend, such as avocados, nuts, seeds, olives? So that's your question. Dr. Katz, in October of 2015, the World Health Organization said red meat has the same level of carcinogenicity as smoking cigarettes. Please explain this, and are there any studies this dramatic about chicken, turkey, or pork? Brenda, what does the evidence say about eggs, or even egg whites? Dr. Willett, what percentage of the studies you review are not biased or paid for by someone with a vested interest in the study? In other words, there was a New York Post article 2 months ago that said red meat is good. So for those of us who are just reading studies, what percentage of these studies are actually accurate, unbiased, not paid for by someone? Sorry about that. Dr. Esselstyn, isn't it possible that when you did your studies, that the studies worked not because people gave up nuts, but isn't it possible that your studies would have worked out just as well if the people were also eating seeds and nuts? Okay? And Dr. Campbell, you say that only 9% of university professors are on tenure and can't get fired. Why does this matter, whether professors are on tenure or just a paid employee? And should we be considering university studies and information out of universities as accurate? And finally, Dr. Popper, I want to go back. Margaret Paul was here on Sunday of last week, and she was very clear. She was saying that men and women sexually have a different sex drive and that, or different experience, that once women go through menopause, that in many cases they have less whatever the hormone is, and they are more likely to connect first emotionally, then sexually, and that therefore it's not really realistic for women to have this expectation when they reach their 50s or whenever menopause is happening, that they should be like they are than when they're younger, yet society keeps telling them that they're supposed to be, and we're shaming and blaming and judging women when the reality is it is normal to have a significant change. And I guess I want to validate this. I'm concerned that if you and Brenda are saying, look, I feel the same way I felt in my 20s and 30s, and there's all these women who are thinking I feel totally different, that they're going to think there's something wrong with them, when Margaret is saying, no, that's the norm. The norm is for women to feel significantly different, especially sexually. So if each of you would answer your question with a 2-minute answer.
So I can start with my question because it's simple. The diet that we serve at the True North Health Center typically is around 15 to 18% of calories from fat, around 10% of calories from protein, the balance from whole plant food, carbohydrates. And so that allows for the inclusion of small amounts of nuts or seeds, up to an ounce a day in the diet, or limited quantities of higher fat vegetable foods like avocado. We don't use any kind of oil of any kind, and we certainly don't use any animal products.
Okay, I'll go next. On the issue of menopause and sex drive and all that sort of thing, it's complicated. And the reason is that if women took care of themselves all through their lives, menopause would be a non-event. Now, that doesn't mean that things don't change. Your relationship with your significant other changes. I mean, there are a lot of things that go into how much sex you want to have and who you want to have it with, right? So I talk to women who are overweight and malnourished and dehydrated and sedentary, and they don't feel good, and it makes you not want to do anything. Sex is just one more of those things that you don't want to do, right? I talk to women who really don't like their husbands very much. And sometimes it's easier to say I'm going through menopause than it is to say I don't like you anymore. If I could have gotten out of here, I would have done it 25 years ago, So that's a factor. So I think that, in response to this woman who spoke last weekend, yes, things change. and they can change. But and one thing I will say, vaginal dryness is an exception to the rule, and that's easy enough to fix with over-the-counter products that don't contain hormones and aren't dangerous and that sort of thing, and we recommend them regularly. But other than that, I think this is an issue of how you take care of yourself, how you feel about yourself, your state of health, and the relationship that you have with somebody else, and that's highly variable. And I don't think that we can basically say that all women go through menopause and it just all goes to hell. I don't think that that's what my experience and a lot of other people's experience has been. And I think for women who have had that experience, I think that there are a lot of mitigating factors, and it isn't just hormonal changes.
Yeah, question I had was about funding of research, and I haven't actually tried to get a tally of what percentage of studies are one way or another supported by industry, but it's way too high. And sometimes it's not very obvious, it's indirect. If we want less biased research, we need to pay for it. And that means public funding through NIH. That's the main mechanism. And there's way too little funding for such an important topic. We've become infatuated with genetics and things like that are really, there'll be some benefits around the margin, but it's not going to have a huge impact on the really major causes of ill health that we have in our society. So there's huge imbalance in the public research community, partly because there's a lot of potential payoffs and gold mines of patents and things like that in the genetic area that we're not going to have ourselves in the nutrition research that we do. I was asked specifically about the study. It was this red meat study that we talked about, saying you can eat all the red meat that you want to eat, and it's not a problem for health. In the Annals of Internal Medicine, the authors claimed no conflict of interest, but it came out of the New York Times that one of the authors, the first author, Dr. Johnson, was in fact paid by a front for the soda industry, which a couple of years ago they exonerated sugar, the same author, the same journal, same editor. Then the Washington Post came out with a story that there was only one senior nutritionist on this paper, where you'd expect a review of red meat would have a lot of experienced nutritionists on it who had done research in this area. One senior nutritionist hadn't done research in this area, but is the chancellor and dean for the Department of Agriculture at Texas A&M University. And that, some would interpret that possibly as a conflict of interest. Washington Post article talked about that, and a couple other stories have more recently. It's sort of like saying, if there's a big review on health effects of potatoes, and the only nutritionist on there is the dean of the Department of Agriculture at the University of Idaho. Now, isn't there, you might suspect there could be a little conflict of interest there. By the way, if you look on the Texas A&M website, December 26th, it declares big story, National Bacon Day. And actually, at first I thought, this is really good. There's one day of the year you can have bacon. No, but that wasn't what the story was about.
The question was whether or not we could still get the same reversal of cardiovascular disease if the patients were having nuts and seeds. And if you ever look at my book on page 69 and on 70, you'll see that where I define that for patients who do not have heart disease, I have no restriction on nuts and seeds. As a matter of fact, with patients with heart disease, I encourage them with either flaxseed meal or chia seeds. And if they have a bun with a few sesame seeds, I don't have a problem with that. But with patients with heart disease, when I started this back in 1985, and we didn't have a lot of the knowledge we had then, but I just knew that I didn't want them to have a lot of saturated fat. So I asked for the heart patients to give up nuts. I had no restrictions on patients who didn't have heart disease, restricting their nuts. But for heart disease, no nuts. Now, it be okay for the patients who have heart disease to have 3 or 4 or 5 walnuts every day? Probably yes, but you will not hear me say that. Why? Why? If anybody ever hears that I said that at this conference, they don't remember I said 3 half walnuts on your cereal. They would say, Esselstyn said nuts were okay. And then what happens, they are so addicting. They're going to be in the glove compartment. They're going to be in the hallway. They're going to be in the bathroom, the basement, the living room, the workbench. They are so addicting, and that's all that saturated fat. That's the last thing that I want my patients seriously ill with heart disease to have. And also, to me, there's yet to be a single study of patients seriously ill with heart disease where you give them peanut butter, cashew sauce, and all the nuts they want, and you arrest and reverse their disease. That hasn't been there. Now, there's a thing called Predimed. Predimed. A little peculiar because the authors always had these ties to the oil industry. They had these ties to the nut industry. And the title of the article was The Reversal of Cardiovascular Disease with the Mediterranean Diet. All right, they had 3 groups. Now, to qualify for this study, you could not have had a diagnosis of cardiovascular disease, okay? 3 groups, all right? So the first group is, well, Mediterranean diet with nuts, Mediterranean diet with oil, second group. Third group, low-fat diet, 39, 37% fat, which is actually quite high. And at the result, in the first group, they were, and actually in all 3 groups, there were scores of patients who had major cardiac events. Cardiac, that's death, stroke, heart attack, and death. And now wait a minute. This was a group that came into this study without any cardiovascular disease, and now all 3 groups developed scores of these major cardiac events. So when the New York Times reporter nailed me and said, Dr. Esselstyn, this disagrees with you, what do you have to say about it? I said, well, look, it's very easy. They created disease in these people who didn't have it before. The title should be changed. It should be the creation of cardiovascular disease with the Mediterranean diet. So now, when I was growing up as a kid, if I wanted nuts, you didn't just open a bag. We had them in the house, but they were always in shells. And there were these weren't specific nut pliers that we had with it. There was this thing that every time you use these pliers, you'd kind of pinch your finger. You had 4 or 5 nuts, that was enough. It wasn't worth working to get them. Nowadays, you go into any gas station, and you can have every kind of nut on earth. And it's in a bag. You don't have to just open it and start chewing them. Now, I guess as we're kind of running the end of our presentations, I have a word I want to say. I don't underestimate for 1 minute the public. Now, it's going to take a longer time for this message to get out. Why do I say I have this confidence in the public? Look at smoking cigarettes. 1964, the Surgeon General report. All right? Boy, it took a while. But do you know that 20 million people have stopped smoking? I remember when I was first married, when Ann and I would have company to the house, we would put out ashtrays with cigarettes in our house. We never smoked, but we thought it was discourteous if you didn't do that. Look at the change. Nobody would think about walking into your house lit up. It's not going to happen. The public has changed. And the other thing that happened was the public changed. I remember when seat belts first came out, people would say, my God, I'm never going to wear one of those. If I drive off into a canal, I'll drown. Well, there haven't been that many canal drownings. and lo and behold, you wouldn't think about sitting down in the passenger seat in the front seat without clipping in. So I really basically have a great optimism that this message can get out as we keep after it, and especially with ambassadors like yourselves.
You asked me to speak about, I think, academic freedom. Was that the question? in any case, there's something similar to that. I find this, for me, this is very personal. I'm very passionate about this idea. In fact, I'm going to go out on a limb and say one of the greatest existential threats to the ability of academics to speak concerns the fact that we have been losing tenure opportunities at university. And the figure the 9% figure I gave to you, Steve, that you read, comes from a 2010 report from the American Association of University Professors, who kind of laid down the rules for this game. That at that time, in 2010, 9% only of all the faculty in the country had achieved not only academic tenure, but also had reached the highest level of full professorship. Only 9%, that was 2010. These days, as the years have rolled by, especially in the last 10 years or so, now we have people almost on hire, adjunct professors, instructors, hired for cheap labor, under the control by the authorities to more or less teach the subject the way they want it to be told. This is a very serious problem. The public tend not to be aware. Now, let me just put a definition, just so we can be on the same wavelength here. Academic freedom is the opportunity to be able to speak what is on our minds without being punished for it or losing our jobs, if you will. That's protected by the concept of tenure, okay? So 9% of the people basically have tenure, and the full boat as far as their level of activity is concerned. When we take away, when that is disappearing from our scene, this is the one place in a society that considers itself to be a democratic society, and I would argue this is almost a core definition of a democratic society, freedom of speech. The First Amendment we have in this country is freedom of speech. One place to practice that art and to illustrate it for the society at large, I would suggest, is in teaching institutions, whether in schools, higher institutions of learning. We have to maintain the opportunity for those who are being trained and have a responsibility to talk about serious matters. We have to maintain the opportunity for those people to have the freedom to say what they feel like saying without being controlled by the university authorities, for example, the one I'm familiar with. And as I say, it's just declined like that. And I'm really concerned now where that's headed. Because if we're going to lose the opportunity for university people, academic people, to be able to maintain their freedom to say what they feel like, what they learned, if we're losing that, and we have lost a lot of it, we're in trouble. And I would suggest that a lot of the misinformation that comes forth is people within the research community, in fact, sort of doing research tethered to corporate money for one thing. Incidentally, I have figures on that wall. That in 2010, again, 2/3 of the funding now is from the corporate sector. I didn't know it was so high. It used to be much lower. But that's one figure that I've learned about, and I think it's more or less true. It's alarming. You know, and when in fact reality it's much nicer to be able to be funded by, public money, but whatever. I just think the academic institutions are in trouble these days, and the public tend not to know this. We're not able to tell. A lot of my colleagues are not able to actually stand up, say what they have to say, according to what they see, be right or wrong, but to say it and have the freedom to say it. And so we've got to be on guard. We're now just sort of drifting into this territory where people are teaching and doing research on hire with special private money. And maybe it's too harsh, Walt. I know you're in a center place, but I think it's a serious problem.
Well, the first thing I want to say to you good people as I look at the time is up sign flashing at us is that sitting through 2.5-hour panel discussions is probably bad for your health. So, Steve, you need to shorten these things. So my question was about meat being a carcinogen. This was a 2015 report from IARC, the International Agency on Research on Cancer, a subsidiary of the WHO. If A causes B one time in 2, and we know it for sure, or if A causes B one time in 200, or 2,000, or 2 million, and we know it for sure, then in each instance we know for sure that A is a cause of B, but the magnitude of risk is very different. That's clear, right? So what IARC concluded was that the quality of evidence linking processed meat to cancer was decisive. They did not say that the magnitude of risk was the same as tobacco. It's not. Processed meat is a bad actor, but it's not as bad as tobacco in terms of cancer risk. And in terms of meat in general, it was a class 2 carcinogen, which simply meant that the evidence was suggestive. Okay, so that's what the IARC report said. Not that eating bacon once a year at Texas A&M will cause as much cancer as smoking daily, but rather a decisive link between processed meat consumption and rates of cancer. Magnitude of risk is smaller, but the quality of evidence was strong.
And it's my bedtime, so I'll make this really fast. My question was about eggs, and I think certainly you can do a search on PubMed and you'll find research on both sides of the argument. But I just want to mention one study that I think is really interesting, and that was a study from Harvard that looked at, was it 280,000 people? Something like that over about 3 decades. So we're looking at just a large number of people. And what they found was taking 3% of calories from animal protein and replacing that with plant protein resulted in a reduced risk of mortality. So this was specifically a mortality, looking at mortality in all of these individuals, and it was quite interesting. So just to put this into perspective, 3% of calories in a 2,000 sort of standard diet, 2,000 calorie diet is about 60 calories. So take 60 calories worth of meat and replace that, or replace that with plants, and this is what you get. 60 calories worth of animal protein and replace it with plant protein, and you get a reduced risk of death. So if it was processed meat, it was a 34% risk reduction. If it was eggs, it was a 19% risk reduction. If it was unprocessed meat, it was a 12% risk reduction. If it was dairy, it was an 8% risk reduction. And if it was poultry or fish, it was a 6% risk reduction. So I think I'll just leave it at that.
I'm very grateful to all of you for coming here, spending your time. We really appreciate it. We don't have this opportunity often. So on behalf of all of the people here on live stream from YouTube in the future, we are so grateful that you all were willing to come today. Thank you.